Good afternoon. Welcome to the Roundtable on Relationships for Growth. My name is Brad Houff. I am one of the founders and the director of the Compass Center for Christian Formation and Leadership. And we are the organization that sponsors the webinar and organizes it. Compass is an organization that's committed to helping Christian leaders learn to live, love, and lead like Jesus. And one of the ways that we do that is by doing these monthly webinars that explore a topic for Christian that we think is important for Christian leaders to think about, and that we hope that will be beneficial for leaders. So we hope that you're able to take a lunch break and kind of a break out of your day and tune in. So we appreciate those of you who are doing that today as we explore these relationships for growth that are counseling, coaching, and spiritual direction. This kind of came about because in October, I was on a webinar with a professor from Fuller Seminary named Dr. Todd Bolsinger. And this was a quote similar to what he said. He said, if I was a bishop, he's talking about a church context. He said, if I was a leader in a church, I would say to anyone under my spiritual counsel that if you try to lead anything without a coach, spiritual director, or therapist, I consider that to be leadership malpractice. And so that was pretty strong words when I heard him say that. And it got my attention because that's part of what Compass does, is providing some spiritual direction and some coaching. But also it got my attention because in my life, I've benefited greatly as a leader by pursuing all three of these disciplines at different points in my own life. I have spent time with a counselor before. I have been in a coaching relationship before, and well. So I think from my own personal experience, these are all important. And I'm glad that we can explore these topics today, some of how these disciplines could benefit you. Let me mention that if you have a question, you can put it in the chat feature. We'll be using that and we'll try to get to some of your questions. And really, this is going to be in three parts. The first will be exploring the three disciplines. We're going to look at each of the three. Then we'll compare and kind of contrast how they're similar and different. And then we'll talk about practicing these disciplines, what it would look like to actually meet with someone for these things. So let me start by introducing the panelists who are on the screen already, but I'll introduce them. Kim Greene is a counselor with the Barnabas Center. And then Steve Perkins is a founder and director of Greenhouse Culture, and he's also a coach. And Susan Cromer is a spiritual director. She does that on her own, and she also does that with Compass as well. So I am friends with all of these folks and have been for a long time. I trust who they are, and I know the good work that they're doing. So that's fun for me to also have them as guest panelists on this discussion. We all live in Richmond, Virginia. So I thought we'd start with just you all saying where you grew up and then what brought you to Richmond. And Kim, since I've known you the longest, I'll start with you.
I grew up in, well, my dad was in the military, so I lived all over the country for most of my life. And so Richmond is actually the longest place I've ever lived anywhere. I moved here in 1990, 7 days after I got married, and began working with college students at the University of Richmond and at Virginia Commonwealth University long ago. So I've been here since
30 years, 30 years ago then.
Yep.
Well, great. Okay. And Steve, how about you? What brought you to Richmond, or where are you from originally?
Yeah, I'm from Michigan, Southwest Michigan. So is my wife, Ashley. And we moved down here about, I think 11 years ago because I took a job at a big Fortune 500 company that's based here in Richmond. But it was funny because we didn't actually know where Richmond was on the map. And I remember saying to my wife, "Oh, it'll be great because we'll be so close to Nashville. We can go watch live music like every weekend." No,
not too close.
But we love it here. We've been here for a while and have a little daughter, Lucy. And yeah.
All right. So you've been here how many years then? You said a little while.
11.
11. Okay, great. Susan, how about you? Where are you from originally, and then what brought you to Richmond?
Born in Texas and lived there a few years. And then most of my growing up years were in the South, but most of it in Virginia, although raised by two parents from the North. So it's interesting that we ended up in the South. Moved to Richmond toward the end of 1999. My husband and I were both working as financial planners, and he took a job as a manager, and that required moving to Richmond. So that's what brought us here. All
right, well, welcome. Even though we don't have a lot of country music, we still have a lot to offer in Richmond. Yeah, so, okay, well, I want to explore, like I said, each of these disciplines kind of one at a time. And first, I'd like you, Kim, to talk some about counseling. What is it at its core, and explain to folks what it's all about.
Okay. Counseling, I would say in general, is usually comes into play when someone's going through some kind of a challenge or a difficulty, intrapersonally inside themselves, or interpersonally between them and another person. And there's all different kinds of counseling. So my feedback today will be, pretty limited in terms of the Barnabas Center and the way we conceptualize what it means to be a person. So there's addictions counseling, there's family counseling, marriage counseling. So counseling in all different kind of areas of life where you might be struggling, again, inside or between you and your world in some way. And then there's also different kinds of counseling in terms of different approaches, like cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're mainly looking at how someone thinks, or narrative therapy, where you're looking at the story of somebody's life, or something in their past. So there's all different approaches. So at the Barnabas Center, our approach is really based on sort of what we do believe it means to be a human being, made in God's image. That's a huge part of our framework, is that each person comes as an image bearer, and that they have longings for intimacy and impact. That's part of what it means for them to be human. And that there's most likely something getting in the way of them experiencing that intimacy and that impact in the way that they were really made to and really desire to. And so that's, so usually they're gonna come in with some kind of a struggle, some pressure point where they're running into that. And so to some degree, we're wanting to obviously offer them help in the presenting problem they bring. But more than that, we're interested in what that struggle might reveal about who they are in their dignity as an image bearer, and what God's doing perhaps in that struggle. And then also what it's like to relate to them. So a lot of counseling is about the relationship between the counselor and the client. Like, usually they say like 80% of it is the dynamic between the counselor and the client, because whatever the client is doing out in the world, relationally, they end up doing in the room. And so counseling is a place where we can pause and say, what's happening between us as we relate to one another, and how, if we examine that, might that help you as you kind of go out into the world? So that's maybe a starting point.
Okay. I've often, I don't remember who I originally heard this but somebody said that counseling is really about understanding the truth about, or Christian counseling in that framework is about understanding the truth about who God is and who the person is. And so you talk about the person being created as an image bearer. So that's part of that, understanding who they are. But what do you think of that as a kind of a definition, Kim?
Yeah, I love that. I'm glad that you said that. A lot of counseling is beginning to be connected to who they are. And, John Calvin actually says, to know God, you must know yourself, and to know yourself, you must know God. And I think it's a chicken and egg thing. I think we can come in at any segment of that. But for sure, a huge part of counseling, again, is looking at these struggles and what might it help that person begin to be aware of about who they really are, what their story really is, and how they're interacting with their world and helping them, being a safe person to help them to begin to be aware of that.
Yeah.
So we want to help fix problems, but that's that is a shallow goal for what I think the richness of what you really get to do when you're in a counseling relationship.
Yeah, that problem, like you used the word presenting problem, that's kind of where you're starting.
Right.
Hopefully they'll begin to understand what's going on there, but it's usually a lot more than just that. So it's the opportunity to explore some other things about who they are and how they relate. And
right. And themes in their life, themes of struggles in their life, themes of their longings, their ways of experiencing relationship. Yeah.
Yeah. Kim, what made you want to become a counselor?
That was been such a great question to reflect on, Brad. One thing I would say is that I think my whole life, I've kind of always wanted to be a counselor. And I was kind of a little bit of a melancholy kid. I was always interested in people's struggles, not only because I wanted to have empathy for them, but also I think it made people really interesting, what they struggle with and what that struggle might reveal about them. So some of it was just a temperament thing. I also think I've been glad to reflect on my mother had some challenges in her childhood, and she went to counseling a lot when I was younger. And really, so in my mind, it was sort of like going to physical therapy or the dentist. It was just, it was in the air as something that you do to grow and take care of yourself as a person, which I'm very grateful for. Then personally, it's funny, when I was in ministry, actually at VCU, we had a counselor who has since passed away, Joe Bowserman. He was a PhD psychologist, come and speak at a Christian meeting. And I asked if I could meet with him later to hear more about his counseling, because I'd always wanted to be a counselor. And he said, I said, I noticed, he said something about he doesn't talk about God right away or something. And at that time I was a young Christian and I was very offended by this, that he doesn't like share the whole message of God's good news with people. And he was kind of puzzled and he said, well, I actually think that all good psychotherapy will walk people to the end of themselves. And that's a really good place to meet God. Well, about 6 years later, I had my second child and I was walked to the end of myself. And my strategies, I was having intrapersonal struggles and interpersonal struggles. And I really did feel like I needed help. I needed someone my life wasn't working the way I had always managed it before. And so I called him and I started meeting with him. And that had a really big impact on me, as I saw he was right, that it's good to examine these places where you bump up against a wall and your ways of living aren't working anymore. And so that was sort of the beginning of me, I think, really starting to consider it as a profession and going back to school.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing some of your personal story there as well, Kim. I appreciate that. Let's move on to coaching. So, Steve, what would you say is at the core of coaching? How does it benefit people? What is it? How do you talk about it with people?
Yeah, and I appreciate everything you just said, Kim, because as people will start to see, there are a lot of overlap and a lot of differences. I like how you gave the background, so I'll give a little of coaching. It kind of was born out of the fact that a lot of corporate executives had some leadership consulting, executive consulting, and then maybe some format of counseling or something more personal. And the two groups were starting to see a lot of overlap, and there was nothing to meet in the middle. And so they started forming what's now known as coaching, professional coaching. I'll give a caveat. The term can be used a lot, I think, out in the world for like somebody who has perfected something. They're an expert. They're like the sports coach who knows what they're doing and they're telling people what to do. And professional coaching is very different, very, very different, because the truest form of it actually never tells you what to do. It's all about drawing things out and asking questions and deep listening. So the term coaching is dangerous. I actually try not to use it myself because it's so misunderstood. It's so new as of like the...
Steve, what word do you use then if you don't use that word?
Yeah, welcome to my world. It's
Okay.
hard. But we just tried to explain what it is because there's so much of that other kind of coaching out there, and it's pretty new. It's a pretty new discipline in the sense. So there's a few buckets, like Kim mentioned, for counseling. There's primarily leadership and executive coaching. There's life coaching. There's career coaching, and a whole bunch of others. What we focus on primarily is kind of in that overlap with that life, leadership, career, where it's really for somebody who's feeling stuck and wanting to move forward in their goals, in their potential, in their purpose. And so I think the biggest difference maybe is that coaching is a little more forward oriented with goals and kind of not as much looking back. It's not a licensed profession in America. It's not a regulated profession. And so there are definitely areas that, especially a lot of things Kim mentioned, that coaches do not and cannot go into. And so it's primarily around, it tends to be a lot around career, just I think because of those, some of those dynamics. But I think for me and for what we do, it comes from a belief that everyone has unique gifts and abilities in them. And this is a number I'm putting on it, but I think most people walk around really at like 20% of who they're capable of being. And so coaching attempts to draw out that other 80% and help you apply it. How do you actually use those gifts, which starts with understanding them? What is your purpose? What's that combination of passion, strength, personality that makes you uniquely you, understanding it, and then kind of moving into applying it, which tends to be a combination of some big picture realizations around your mindsets and your kind of the story you tell yourself, as well as a lot of tactical, like how do you communicate? How do you, how do you build relationships and maintain those? How do you actually set goals and achieve them? So a lot of like productivity stuff falls into the coaching bucket. But I think a lot of times just people feeling stuck and they need some kind of process or somebody to be an accountability or thought partner.
Mm-hmm. Steve, you mentioned a couple times the idea of drawing things out of people. When I hear you talk about that, I think about the best coaches are the people that can help players, if we're talking sports, can help players reach their potential. And those often are not the best, who were the best athletes themselves. Often the best coaches are people who are better at drawing those things out of others. So say more about what that looks like to help kind of draw that out of people.
Yeah, and that's a really good point you make. You look at some of the best coaches over time, especially the ones who are consecutively year over year really successful. I think the main way it plays out is a lot of really kind of two things: really good listening and really good questions. And I think this is one of those overlap points for all three of us, is we're professional question askers, we're professional listeners. And in fact, in coaching school, you kind of learn these various layers, levels of listening, because a lot of our interaction, especially modern day America, we're listening way at the surface level. Like I'm just kind of reacting to what you said or actually focused on what I want to say next. Mm-hmm. And you go like 3 to 5 levels deeper, and I'm not even listening to the words you're saying. I'm more looking for what's going on inside you and what's not being said. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times the biggest self-awareness that comes out of coaching is from, you might be telling me a story, Brad, and we don't actually coach around what you just said. We coach around the way you told me the story. Like, wait a minute, it seems like you're actually really uncomfortable with that one part. Your voice changed when you said that, so let's dive into that. And it tends to be the ability to kind of call to the surface what's either not being, the person's not aware of, not recognizing it, mm-hmm. or maybe they do recognize it, but they haven't dealt with it and done anything about it.
Yeah. I remember meeting one time, this was just a friend who told me as I was talking about something, they said, you really started to light up when you talked about that. And that reminds me of what you're saying here, that that's something that I should have, would need to pay attention to, that seemed to be something that I was really passionate about. So sometimes it takes another person to point those things out for us to say, hey, that's something that you need to pay attention to and maybe do something with.
Yeah, it's a great example. And, in this context, I find when I coach people in ministry context, one of the most common things is because of the nature of full-time ministry, you tend to define your whole self based on it. Like the ministry is you are this ministry. And I believe that's not how God sees you, that you are a person created apart from that. And so a huge part of coaching for people in that situation is separating the two and saying, okay, but who are you outside of your job and your role? And understanding that person, and then you can apply back into the role. Like, okay, so how do you show up? What do you do differently? But kind of separating the identity from what you do.
That sounds like that would be really helpful to have somebody help any of us do that. Steve, what made you want to become a coach?
Well, I'll be honest with my story. So I used to be an engineer. Then I worked in Fortune 500, kind of like corporate America stuff. And I never felt like I fit. Ever since I was little, I thought about what I wanted to be when I grow up. And I would ask questions about what's my purpose. So I'm with you, Kim. I was kind of maybe the odd kid in that sense. But, and I used to joke like, well, that doesn't give you a career path. What am I going to do? Get paid to have conversations with people? And now I do. But so I was always into personal development, leadership stuff, like thinking about your life. And I was just, in my experience in corporate America, I was frustrated that we'd go to conferences, we'd read books, we'd have, talks and group trainings, and the change that was introduced in those settings seemed to never stick. It was like, okay, I'm really inspired while I'm at this conference, and then I get back on Monday and it's all gone. It's back to the old habits. And so as I started to experience coaching for the first time, and I would say actually these other two disciplines as well, in my personal life, spiritual direction and counseling, it's the first time I ever saw where the change would actually stick. It's like, it would actually work because you're working on it in little steps over time. And there's an accountability to it. And there's okay, now I'm going to take a next step and a next one and the next one. And for me, I think maybe it's the engineer in me. I was really frustrated about stuff that didn't actually work. And I was really, really excited when I saw these kind of helping professions really actually work to create real change in your life. And so my whole struggle of what's my calling, what's my purpose, how do I live into more of my potential in my career really started to come through coaching.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we can all identify with that, of the idea of feeling like we want to see change. There's ideas that have changed, or thinking we think our thinking is changing, but it's not finding its way into our lives, the change that we want. So you're kind of saying it's not sticking. And that's kind of the value of having another person working with us to really integrate that from what we're thinking about to how we're actually living. So we need people to do that for us. Susan, we'll come to you now. Spiritual direction. In one sense, it might be the oldest of these, but I guess you could find examples of all of these in the scripture for sure. But the church has a long history of spiritual direction. What would you say is at the core? What is spiritual direction? How does it benefit people?
Yeah, I think spiritual direction is about deepening your relationship with God or exploring your relationship with God, because like Kim said, viewing people as image bearers, created in the image of God, And his desire, when he's created each one of us, is to have that intimate relationship and to love us deeply and well. And so learning how to receive that love from him, I think, is an important part of spiritual direction. So it's deepening intimacy. It's a place where you can question and express frustrations and concerns and longings, like Kim talked about in counseling. All those things are part of spiritual direction. I think too, it's a place to be able to learn to look at yourself honestly and in a redemptive way, to see yourself as God sees you. That's a really important piece of spiritual direction, because I find that we, even though we might say that we know who we are as far as being created in the image of God, when we sort of dig beneath the surface, most of us really struggle with that. And so that's a real important piece. I think also that it's a place where we put ourselves in a position for God to care for us, to tend to our souls, to nurture us, to correct us, to guide us. It's a place for discernment. I think another term for spiritual direction is holy listening. And I really love that description of spiritual direction. Kind of goes along with some of the things Steve said, that it's a place that we can, when you're in a relationship with a spiritual director, so the spiritual director listens to you, and then the two of you together intentionally listen to the Holy Spirit in a session. And so that's a really beautiful piece to me. It's also described as, spiritual directors can be described as sort of midwives for the soul. So the things that God is working and creating and birthing in you, a spiritual director sort of helps to deliver those things. So
yeah, those are helpful images to think about. This idea of some common themes that I see here are paying attention. What do you need to pay attention to? And I think, Susan, you're also saying that's probably God doing something here that you need to pay attention to. And then how do you want to respond to what God's doing?
right.
He's, in one sense, you're saying he's trying to birth something in you, grow something in you, there's a work that's happening that you get to respond to and hopefully cooperate with.
Right. Yeah. And I feel like part of what was heightened for me when I went through the program I went through to become spiritual director was being aware of how this happens for all people, that God is drawing all people and working in all people, whether they're aware of it or not. And so sometimes people don't even know why they want to come and see a spiritual director. And so that's been a really cool part of it for me, is to be able to witness that work of the Spirit in people. So
yeah. Can I ask you the question of as well, what made you want to become a spiritual director?
yes, yeah. So I also, since a little child, have wanted to do things that maybe were in some sort of helping profession, but had never heard of spiritual direction. In fact, probably 10 or 12 years ago, a friend of mine called me and said, have you ever thought about being a spiritual director? And I was like, no, because I've never heard of that. I don't know what that is, and it sounds really odd to me. But she talked to me about what it was. And so I thought, that's a little out there. But the more I thought about it, I just felt the Lord drawing me to that. And so I did some reading, I did some praying, and felt like the Lord was really calling me to do that. And so she had a few follow-up calls with me, urging me, encouraging me to do this. She said, I think this is what you're supposed to do. And I think it would be a really good thing for you. And so that's sort of what caused me to dive into that.
how grateful you must be for that friend. And for all of us, we probably have all had people that have nudged us in these directions to say, this is something you should pay attention to. It's again, the idea of the importance of trusted companions who will help us lean into what our callings are. And I think all of you are doing that as well, and you've done that. So, all right, well,
And Brad,
yeah.
can I just say something real quick?
Mm-hmm.
One thing I love about what Susan does and what you mentioned about receiving from God, for anyone who's listening who came up in kind of a local church or spiritual situation like me, where it was very focused on doing, like I think all of us try to help people balance between doing and being, and it was so much about what you do and what you're doing. And so I find it very refreshing and helpful. That whole receiving from God was often, I mean, for me, never even part of it at all. And to learn how to listen and receive from him was so, in a sense, like extra critical for me, or somebody who had my kind of background.
Yeah, and in one sense, though, that's where we start, right? With God, is receiving his love for us. It starts before we do anything to make ourselves worthy or acceptable. We begin with God by receiving his love for us.
And I just want to respond to Steve. I love that you brought that up, Steve, because that is a really common thing for a lot of people, is that God couldn't really care about me because I haven't done enough good stuff, you know? And so that's to have people become aware that you're not the only person who feels that way. That's a very common thing. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Well, let's, I want to now turn our, kind of switch gears a little bit. And if you guys have questions, those of you who are listening in the webinar, feel free to type those in. If we can get to some of those, we'll try to. But the next question I have for the panelists, and Kim, I'm going to start with you on this, is, and we've touched on it, but how are these disciplines similar? What are some of the ways that they're similar? Let's explore that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, already I think we've seen that there's a lot of overlap, and it's so encouraging to hear Susan and Steve talk about their own discipline. I think some of the things I hear them saying that I resonate with the similarity across the board are that we all believe that we're made for companionship, and that you just don't get through life by yourself, and you don't need to. And so all of us are seeking to join a person at a point of need, and maybe at a point of desire, maybe even. We're all talking about ways we've gained skill, like Steve mentioned, in listening. Susan mentioned that. Both of them talked about questions. This deep listening, that's a really holy and reverent process to listen to somebody, and to listen even underneath their words. And that all of us have found that to be so important that we've sought training in how to do that, and how to listen, and how to ask questions and hear underneath. But the other thing that strikes me is that in all three disciplines, no one thinks they're in control of what's happening. I love how Steve talked about, I'm not here to tell people what to do. And Susan talks about listening with the other person for what the Holy Spirit is doing, like partnering versus having an agenda. And so that feels to me something that's also very similar, is that is the agenda for the time, is joining, listening, using our skills in being able to hear and to see and to point things out and name things. But there's not another agenda. I'm not trying to get the person to do something else. And it sounds like I hear that in what Susan and Steve are saying also. And I think that makes all of these very sort of unique and sacred, really.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too that Steve said that a coach really doesn't coach, like tell you. And right. Susan I know spiritual directors would say, we don't really direct people. We feel like it's the Spirit that's directing them.
Exactly.
So I think that's pointing to, Kim, what you're saying, that there's something that you're not trying to control it. you're trying to respond to what we believe is the good work that God is doing in the person.
Yeah, and the good work in how we're made. I mean, Psalm 139, that we're fearfully and wonderfully made. I love what Steve said about a lot of times we're interacting with like 20% of the person, that we're skilled in listening for what the Spirit is doing and for how people are made, and being able to pull those things out that they don't think are even a thing.
Mhm.
How would the others of you respond to some of what Kim said as well? Similarities, or how do you see some of the similarities? Anything else you want to add to that?
I just want to acknowledge that I love hearing the similarities, because I probably came in thinking there are a lot of differences. But now, after hearing Kim and Steve talk, I'm thinking, oh, there are a lot more similarities than there are differences. So that's been really neat to hear that, and to know that the three of us, while we've experienced all these different things with different people, and that's something else that I would say, this maybe isn't addressing your question, but it just came to me, is the freedom to know, just like each of us is made differently, we in our professions are all made differently and relate to people differently. And so if you try one of these three disciplines and it doesn't go well for you, or it doesn't feel good, don't give up, because there are lots of people available, and to know that while you don't jihad maybe with every person, there will be somebody that you do.
May I just respond to that briefly? I actually have seen people, like I've had clients leave me and go get spiritual direction, or leave and go get coaching.
Yes.
I've had clients leave me, go get coaching. That's how I heard about Steve, actually, and then come back when they're moving into some other conflicted area they need help with. So I think Susan's right. Even there's seasons for these things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Steve, this kind of leads us into talking a little bit about some of the differences, I think, as well, because I think Steve and Susan would probably also agree there's times where they've referred people to counseling as well, because of things that have come up in their helping relationship with people as well. Would you agree with that, Steve?
Yeah, I've referred people a number of times. And I mean, often in my situation, it's because we're dealing with some kind of goal or drawing out someone's potential. And in that exploration, we butt up against something in the past, some kind of pain or some kind of wound or something that, like I said before, I'm not the right person to deal with that. I'm actually not trained in those areas. And so referring them to a specific kind of counselor often comes up. But kind of like you said, Susan, this is helping me be more informed about spiritual direction too, and where there might be good opportunities to send people that way, which I've done some before. But I agree, yeah.
Let's transition a little bit to the second part then. We know there's some similarities, but we've also touched on some of the differences. Susan, how would you describe some of the differences in these disciplines, if you could kind of lead us off in that with that?
So let me begin this by saying, maybe some of the things I've thought were not exactly right, but I'll share with what I came with, is thinking that maybe counseling is for a time period and is more problem solving, either intra or interpersonal relationship issues, or things that have happened that have caused trauma, that kind of thing. That was my understanding before today. I've had a little bit of enlightenment here. And then coaching, I always thought was more goal oriented, which may or may not be right. Also for a certain period of time. And from my perspective, spiritual direction maybe is a little bit different. While there are a lot of similarities, it's a little bit different in that, from my perspective, it's an ongoing, like through your whole life kind of thing. So it's not just when you have a question or there's trauma or there's a struggle, or it's something for me that good times, bad times, whatever, because I'm continuing to walk down that road with God. It's an ongoing thing. And like Kim said, having somebody with you by your side to be able to see things that maybe you don't see, or recognize things to help you do that. So maybe there aren't as many differences, and maybe those differences are not right, and Kim and Steve can address those things, I think.
Well, okay. Steve, Kim, what do you think about differences?
I think, Susan, I love what you said there. Yeah, I would say in general, that I like that thing you said about spiritual direction can be an ongoing thing. I mean, sometimes counselors see someone for a long time, but we always want to be aware of what we're working on and why we're meeting. And often we want to move people through a process and then acknowledge you're kind of in a good spot right now. Like Steve used that word stuck, that people come in, this leads into the next thing, but they may come in stuck. And then we look into the past, or we kind of open that up and see, where are you getting hooked or stuck? And then once that is, they've got some tools and they've got some awareness, sometimes that's the end of counseling, at least for a season. So I do think that's a good example of a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Steve, you got any thoughts about differences?
I'm also in the boat of this conversation is making me even more aware of the similarities. But, you know, one thought I had maybe more on that side of things is that I was getting the picture of like someone who wants to get more physically in shape. Because I'm in that boat right now, post Thanksgiving. I'm like, all right, our gym just opened back up. I want to get in there. I want to get back in shape a little more. But you almost always reach that point where it's like, okay, I'm my own worst enemy. Like I have good intentions, but I'm not actually doing what I want to do. I'm not following through. And I know this is big for coaching, and I think it might be similar for the other two, that when you've kind of reached the end of yourself in that way, like you need accountability, you need a partner, you need that outside influence to kind of get you to actually take action on what you have intentions about. And that's something that's really big for coaching, is those action steps. But I get the sense it's similar for the other two. Is it somebody who's a third party, you know?
Well, this kind of leads me, Steve, what you were saying, into our third section here of kind of how do we know when we're ready and to do any of these. And I think you're bringing up something, a desire for change, right? A desire to not be stuck anymore. There's at some point you've got to say, I'm motivated enough to want to ask somebody to help me because I don't want it to be the way it is right now. So that would be one way that people would know if they're ready, or maybe this is a time for them to try this. What would be some other reasons that you would suggest that somebody's ready to, you can stick to your discipline. Steve, when is somebody ready for coaching?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of times it's what I just shared about, I'm tired of being in that stuck place and not being able to take action on what I want to do. Or it can be a mental stuckness, especially in that area of career calling. If I just don't know, like whatever I'm doing doesn't fit, I'm not in the right spot, I just don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I mean, the reason I love coaching on that is because that was my story. Is I would see these people on stages talk about their purpose and your calling and follow God's calling for your life. And I kept thinking for years, like, how do you figure that out? Does it hit you like you wait for the lightning to strike one day when it just appears? Like, I really thought that's apparently how it works. How do these people know their purpose? And then for a long time, I really didn't like that question, because I thought, well, you don't have a purpose. Like, our purpose is to follow God and live our life. And I think at this point in life, I've come to believe everyone does have uniqueness to their calling. And the answer is already inside you. You just have to stop and look inside yourself and look in your past experiences to draw that out. Like, one of the things we often do with people is look back to what you played as a kid, and there's a lot of clues in that to what your calling might be now. And so it was like, okay, what's the process for figuring out that calling? Like, people can just say it on the stage, but then you walk away and you're like, how do I do that? And so, yeah, I think for me, that was a big part.
Yeah, I'd like to think about this in terms of, so there's desire, and you're talking about somebody to understand their calling. Everybody wants that, but then there's also, is the person motivated enough to want to kind of put in the work and spend the time exploring that, even if and the money to pay somebody to help them with that.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's like, you can't just be kind of interested, like, oh, that sounds nice. Speaking specifically for coaching, you got to be ready to really make an investment and really change. And that is when people are like, okay, I need some help here.
Yeah. Kim and Susan, what would you say? When is somebody ready for counseling, Kim? When would you say that?
I think sometimes it's a little murkier for counseling. I think that a person's ready when they want to invite someone into the struggle they're having. They're willing. Something's going on in them that's difficult, and they keep going around in their mind 70 ways to Sunday, and they're not getting anywhere, or they keep having feelings that they can't control, they can't regulate. They're traumatized by something, or they have a relationship that just doesn't show any signs of progress, and that they're desiring someone to hear about that. And sometimes I think that's as far as we are. I don't have a view for, I think this is true in my own life. A lot of times, something's wrong, but you have no idea what would be right or what even health would be like. And even the act of putting words to the struggle that we're so ashamed of, that's to be ready to do that, even if you don't know why you're doing it or where you think it's going to lead, I think is an incredible act of faith and strength and courage. So sometimes people come to counseling and I ask them, how is it to come in the room today? And they start crying and they're like, I don't know why I'm crying. Because they're just not that far yet in their thinking, and that's where they need someone to join them and begin to ask them questions. So anyway, so the willingness to do that humbling work of sitting and letting someone see you struggle, or that you are struggling in some way, I think is a huge piece of the readiness, even if you don't know if you're ready to work.
The willingness to let somebody in.
Just to let someone in is hard enough. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it takes 3 months just to sit with someone before they're ready to really say more.
The first time I ever met with a spiritual director, the question they led and when we sat down was, tell me what's on your heart today. And I just started crying because there was so much emotion, and no one was asking me that question. My spouse cared about that and would talk about that, but there wasn't somebody else that was saying, tell me what you're carrying, tell me what's burdening you, what's on your heart today. So that I had a desire to experience letting somebody in on those things, and I didn't even know it till they asked me that question.
Right, that's a great example.
I want to ask or move to a question that a panelist has here, and they said, how do we reduce the stigma for people who think that they're asking for professional help? Kind of like, Steve, you're smiling, so why don't you start with that then?
Yeah, well, it was exactly what I was just about to say. And I think, especially because I don't know the stats on this, but I've experienced, especially with a lot of men there and different subcultures, there is a stigma, or there's a sense that, well, if you go to counseling, there's something wrong with you. And these things that keep us from going to a specific helping profession. Let me just say, in my experience and for myself, I think everyone should have some forms of this type of stuff in their life at various points. And I heard a friend say it like this. This is a little dangerous. I'll caveat at the end, but I liked it. He said, he said, a lot of my peers think that it's so weird that I go to counseling, like there's something wrong with me. I just think of it like a tune-up for your car. Like you wouldn't drive your car for 20 years without getting tune-ups.
That's right.
And I know that counseling and these other helping professions are way more than just a tune-up, but I thought it was a helpful analogy. Like you wouldn't expect to just run your car really successfully and well for years and years and years without any attention to it. And so I kind of feel on a mission to like break those stigmas, because I think we are, like I said, going around operating at 20% of who we're capable of being if we're not dealing with our pain, if we're not actually talking about what's going on, if we're not receiving God in our life, if we're not kind of understanding our potential. So I know we have a time limit, but I could talk about that one for hours. I think it's such an important question.
Yeah. Well, okay. I want to also comment on that and say that I entitled this Relationships for Growth, because I really do feel like it's the people who want to grow and experience God's goodness, and it's forward thinking, and it's kind of healthiness. I could have said relationships for keep you from losing your mind, relationships to keep you from going off the deep end. I mean, but I really do feel like these are the kind of healthy, I could have called it that, relationships for healthy living, that we've got to, it might be hard for other people to understand that it's about health and growth, but if we understand that, I think that can be what motivates us. Of course, we're going to deal with the broken parts of us and the parts that we want to see change, but that's not, it's really out of a desire to live healthily the way God wants us to live. I want to, one of the questions here is that somebody asked about how to find a spiritual director, and how long do you usually meet? Susan, why don't you talk about that a little bit of how do you meet with people? What do you do it over technology? How many sessions do you usually meet? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, right now it's all over technology for me. Pre-COVID, I did both. I would meet with people, because I meet with people who don't live in Richmond as well, via technology, but I prefer face-to-face. I'm just not doing that right now. And normally I meet with somebody once a month is pretty typical for spiritual direction. When people are beginning, when they're first starting out, sometimes it's a little more frequently than that, but once a month is because there needs to be some time in between for them to be able to work through some of the stuff that that may have been uncovered during the session, or may still continue to be uncovered after we meet. So.
Well, I know this from knowing, talked with Kim and Steve, that also any of these things are not a one and done, like a one-time session. There would be some benefit, but there will be more benefit over time to see some of the growth and the change that's the potential for that. So if you're going to enter into this, I think with any of it, I think, Kim, you said maybe kind of 6 or 8 sessions would be a good way to kind of think about that.
To start,
to start. Yeah. And Steve, the same thing, that you would, if you're going to start working with someone in coaching, it's not just going to be a one session, right? You would want to meet with them several times.
Right. Yeah. For our kind of coaching, we typically do every other week for an hour over a 6-month period.
All right. Another question that somebody asked me is, how do you guys want to relate to the local church, or the church? How do you want to encourage ministry leaders, church leaders? Could one or two of you speak to that?
Yeah, I can start. I've often thought of, I'm a very visual person. So for years, and Brad, you know this, because we've talked about it, I would sit in a church service on a Sunday and think, this is so good, but it's this big high level message, and also the aspects of worship, corporate worship, but especially the message, since that's kind of a main part of a lot of local church, rhythms these days. Then it's this high level message. I now have to go in and apply it to my life and to my relationships, my walk with God. So how do I make that translation? And so a lot of times I would see people walk out the doors, and I would literally stand in the hall and watch them all walking out, just wondering, like, how many of them are going to get it into their lives this week, and how. And I play music, so I think about like transposing music. You know, somebody has to actually change it from like the language of sermon on the stage, or, you know, whatever, take whatever context you might be in a local church, to transposing it into my life and what it looks like in my relationships. And that's, I think that's a really big part of at least how I would explain the relationship of coaching to the local church.
Yeah, it's again kind of this idea that there's truth, and we need to understand the truth about who God is and who we are, and we can hear it, but then applying that to our lives, we need, typically most of us need other people to help us really do that well. So
yeah, it's a whole set of things, and you think about each person has a unique personality. One message, one point is not going to apply the same way to everybody, and that's, I think, maybe something we just kind of have assumed in the popular context.
Yeah. Well, I know, because I know all of you all personally, I would, you personally meeting with people would be great. Of course, that's what you do, but also people like you all have other people that you work with as well. So obviously they can find out more, Kim, about Barnabas Center by going to your website, and then Greenhouse Culture, and also Compass Center. We do spiritual direction, and Steve does some coaching for Christian leaders through Compass as well. So go to those websites if you want to find out a next step of how you could contact one of these people or the people that work with them as well. I want to end our time, and we might go a few minutes over, but I want to end, I ask each of them to think about, without sharing the name of a person particular, or the details that might identify that person, to think about a person that's really seen some transformation in their own life, and if they could share some stories, a story of that. So Steve, why don't you kick us off with what's a story that might kind of help somebody get a vision for what coaching can be?
Sure. So I'll keep it short here, but I actually have a client who was an executive pastor, and still is partially in that role, and also a business owner. So I thought this might apply to this current webinar. But this person came to coaching saying, okay, I want to really enjoy my work and use my gifts. So I want to understand that better. And I also want to invest in developing others better. And just had some, again, stuckness and confusion around this point in his career, and where he needed to go next, what his next steps needed to be. So I think a lot of what he realized was he was stuck on his own personality. Like, he was someone with lots of ideas and hard to follow through and hold himself accountable. So again, needed that third party, that somebody to be a thought partner. And he had tons of light bulb moments along the way in little things. But I think the biggest aha moment that came out of the coaching relationship was realizing that he is all about developing others, and that is his like outward mission statement to others, but he wasn't living it himself. So he was still holding all on to all of the work himself. Like, in these roles he had in his career, he was trying to do everything instead of delegating ownership to others. And he realized what he needs to do is actually start to develop other leaders to take over things that were on his plate. And so I think that was a good example of where it started with a lot of self-awareness and understanding his unique gifts and calling, and then like moving that into the application of how does he need to change in his functions, in his job functions, to live that stuff out. And that's kind of what it looks like.
Great example. Kim, can you think of a story from counseling that would encourage folks, a picture of transformation?
Yeah, I think about a guy that I was seeing, this was a few years ago, who came because he was having conflict in his marriage where he just kept shutting down during conflict and couldn't look at his wife and felt ashamed and stupid whenever there was a conflict between them and he felt disappointed. And so he came, and that was sort of the thing that he started with. And as we began to look at his bigger story, we found that growing up, he was in a family with multiple siblings, and he was the littlest, and he always felt stupid. And like he couldn't keep up with his other siblings, and often didn't understand what they were doing, and suffered some measure of abuse from them. And so, so for him to even be able to say, I feel stupid, and for him to even begin to tell me the stories where that belief about himself got formed, was growth in and of itself. I think Steve mentioned this earlier, didn't you say something about tiny steps of growth? Like, it's so tiny. So him even coming and saying, I feel stupid, is like a transformation, I think. So as we're talking about that story of where those beliefs about himself got formed, then as he and I are working together, he has moments where he feels vulnerable as he and I are together, and he starts looking down, and I say, what are you thinking? And he says, I feel stupid. I'm afraid that you think this is taking too long, that I'm not getting it fast enough. That's how he's always felt. That's how he felt in his childhood. That's how he feels with his wife. So he and I get to say, tell me what it's like to be in this moment where you think you're afraid that you're stupid, that you're working too slow. And I get to join him there and get to give him a different kind of experience of, I actually don't think he's stupid at all. I think he's an incredibly deep person that needs time to process deeply. And I want to give him that time to process deeply. So he begins to experience actually that he's an incredibly gifted, insightful, and deep person that needs time. And so he begins to come into sessions with that kind of confidence, like, this is worth me giving my time to, versus this is because I'm dumb. So that's an example.
Sounds like a great gift. Thank you for sharing that. Susan, can you think of a story from spiritual direction that is an encouragement for somebody to pursue this?
Yeah, I was meeting with a woman. This has been several years ago, and still meet with her. But she came in. She's in ministry, and she came in, and for the first 8 or 9 months, we made some of those tiny little steps. And then she came in one day after about 8 or 9 months, and she was talking to me about a passage of scripture that she had heard in a sermon, Steve. So this is kind of interesting with your application there. And she kept repeating the scripture over and over during our session. She kept quoting it to me for various reasons. And I kept feeling like the Holy Spirit was saying to me, pull out your Bible and read that scripture. And I was like, I don't want to do that. She's just quoted it to me, 10 times. I don't want. But finally I did. I pulled out my Bible and I began to read the passage. And I got to a place where it said something like, as I have loved you, or I love you. And she began to bawl. And she had left that part out of the passage. And she just was so moved. And she said, I spend all day, every day, sharing the love of Christ with other people, helping them to know and understand how he loves them. And I don't believe he loves me. And so it was really a pivotal moment for her. And there's at the end of Matthew 11, if you'll just give me a quick chance here to say, in the message, it says this, Jesus is speaking and he says, keep company with me and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. And that's kind of, I think, what happened for her. When I called to ask permission from her to share this story, she said, the freedom that I have experienced since that time is just so wonderful. So I think that's a good story.
Well, let me again, I want to say first off, thank you for being a part of this today, but more importantly, thank you, all three of you, for the important work that you're doing to help people. And for those of you who are listening, I would encourage you to reach out to the organizations that these folks are part of if you want more information about how to enter into relationship. And there's other organizations that do this stuff as well. But we think that to kind of go back to the quote I started with, that it would be malpractice to not have some sort of spiritual companion if you're trying to lead others. And I don't care if you're trying to lead a family or you're trying to start a business or you're trying to lead a ministry. If you're trying to do that well, it would be malpractice to not have some spiritual companions who are helping you along the way. And so thank you for the important work that you're doing. Thank you all who are listening. If you want to share this, we'll try to, by the end of the week, post this on our YouTube channel. Just you can Google Compass Center YouTube and that should come up. But we thank you all for participating, and we hope to see you at another roundtable that we do in January as well. Thanks so much.